Welcome back to Aetheral Space 3.13. We are back.
Aetheral Space.
Aetheral Space.
Aetheral Space!
Yeah, so what happened last time?
So last time, the fight continued. Things were getting pretty ugly. Marie was blasting away, and Simeon was barely parrying, and her body was, like, burning to death, and her eye was popping out, and she was just like, this is fine. And then our team flew off in their car, and they're like, we did it! We got away! And then the fucking fifth dead went on the roof, like, stuck his hand through the roof, pulled out Dragon, was like, you're not who I want, and threw him off the edge of the car, and probably to his death. Unless he suddenly figures out how to use Musazi's thruster ability. And I don't want to be too jokey because I feel like this is going to be a serious scene. So I'm gonna try to do this seriously. So I'm gonna purge all the silly from my body.
Okay.
All right, are you ready?
Yeah.
Dragon blinked as he watched the car above him quickly shrink, reaching out a grasping hand as if he could just seize hold of the now tiny shape and pull himself back up. I'm going to die, he thought, before he realized that wasn't quite true. He'd already been killed the moment that man had thrown him off the car. Everything from that point onwards was just a formality. How long would he fall before becoming tomato sauce? He wasn't sure. They'd only been in the mid-level section of Talden, but even so, that was still absurdly high up. If he didn't hit an unkindly placed balcony or platform, he could be falling for quite a long time. Hell, he'd probably die of boredom before hitting the bottom. A delirious chuckle tried to escape his throat, only to be swallowed by the rushing air. Was there anything he could do? Unlikely. Maybe if he'd trained his Aether a little more, he could have come up with some ability that would come in handy here. Unfortunately, the most he could really do was infuse the stuff into his body or objects he was holding, and that wouldn't do him much good here. Could he, maybe harden his body to survive the fall?
That's a big fucking fall, dude.
I know. He blinked years of frustration away.
Sorry, that's...
This wasn't fair.
It still works, but it was meant to be tears.
Oh, he blinked tears of frustration away. This wasn't fair. Damn it, this wasn't fair! For the first time since ever, probably, he'd felt like he didn't really know how he'd felt, but it was good. He'd wanted it to keep going, even if he didn't have the words to describe it. Ruth, Bruno, Serena, even Skipper, okay, maybe not Skipper as much, had made him feel like he didn't know. He didn't know, but he wanted to. He wanted that chance. Unfortunately, gravity wasn't a force very sympathetic to impassioned speeches. Looked like he was dead. Too bad, so sad. Again, he looked up at the black object in the sky longingly. If only he'd been a little quicker to react. If only he'd been sitting a little further from the window. If only... Come to think of it, he really shouldn't be able to see the car anymore, should he? He'd fallen way too far. In that case, what was the shape that he was looking up at? Clothes billowing around him from the wind, Dragon squinted, staring up with as much visual acuity as he could muster. The shape that was even now growing bigger definitely wasn't a car. The shape was all wrong. Rather than the brutal square of a vehicle, it instead looked... humanoid? Oh, no fucking way. Bruno Del Ced was falling towards him, limbs splayed out like some kind of starfish, while an expression of utmost concentration consumed his face. He'd thrown away that cloak he'd been wearing at some point, leaving only the purple shirt and black pants he'd been wearing beneath. Similarly, purple aether crackled around him. What had happened? Had their attacker thrown Bruno out of the car after Dragon? No, that wasn't what Bruno's eyes were saying. There was a purpose there, a clear goal. None of this was a surprise to him. The sound was drowned out by the fact they were falling at horrific speeds through an urban hellscape, but Dragon saw Bruno's mouth move, saw him struggling to call out to him, saw the words those lips were forming. Dragon! Bruno was saying silently. Dragon could have slapped him if the laws of physics permitted it. What the hell was he thinking? If Bruno had really been stupid enough to jump out after him, all he'd managed to do was turn a murder into a murder-suicide. Even if Bruno used his Aether to create a force field beneath Dragon, it wouldn't be the rescue the boy was clearly hoping for. All it would accomplish was turning his body in to catch up early. Dragon opened his mouth to try and shout something back, but all he accomplished was getting his own hair in his mouth, reducing him to a spitting wreck for a few seconds. As he opened his eyes again, he saw Bruno's mouth move again, only the slightest hint of anxiety present in those movements. "Hold on," Bruno said, clearly trusting that Dragon would be able to read his lips, and then Bruno Del Ced began to accelerate. At first, Dragon couldn't believe his eyes as Bruno's fall clearly got faster, the boy growing in his vision second by second. What the hell was he hoping for? A mid-air collision? More to the point, how was he doing it? It only took another glance for Dragon to figure that out. The air behind Bruno was rippling wildly, like a more intense version of one of his force fields, and over the roar of the hungry city, he could hear something like the sound of smashing glass, over and over again. The force fields. He was creating force fields right behind himself and then instantly destroying them, using the resultant force to increase his falling speed. It was ingenious, Dragon had to admit, but still clearly suicidal. Now close enough that Dragon could see the whites of his eyes, Bruno strained to bring his outstretched arms back together, as though trying to engulf Dragon in an unwelcome hug. Dragon hesitated. Bruno didn't look like someone about to die. This time, Bruno's mouth didn't move, but his eyes got the message across just as easily. Trust me. Dragon blinked, reached out a hand. If he was going to die either way, where was the harm in just believing for once? Alright, you take over.
Musashi lunged forwards, plunging luminescence in front of him in a clearly telegraphed attempt to stab Rayonch. The grey-haired man, as expected, deflected the blow with his knife, using the flat side of the blade to redirect the force and send Musashi stumbling forwards. As I said, fellow warrior, Rayonch intoned, calm yourself, and perhaps we can work as one in this matter. Musashi gritted his teeth. A boar who could do nothing but endlessly defend was no warrior, just a distraction. He was not using the power he obviously possessed to pursue his own desires, but simply to prevent Musashi from attaining his. This man was useful only for standing in the way of others. Unforgivable. Angie. The car that had been carrying Hadrian was already out of sight, but if Musashi could dispatch this annoyance and proceed, he knew that he could catch up. His window of opportunity was rapidly shrinking, though, and the anger with which he was operating only expedited that. If he was to prevail here, he had to act calmly and decisively. Marie's barrage hadn't sufficed to destroy those enemies, but it had done enough to ensure that any conflict would be between him and Rayonch alone. The bowman would be preoccupied blocking Marie's attacks, and that young girl Noelle was nowhere to be seen. The only person he had to blame for failure here would be himself. Musashi lowered his body to the ground, assumed a ready stance. He'd bet everything on a single strike, strong enough to snap that knife like the toy it was. Rayonch seemed to realise what was about to happen, and he narrowed his eyes as he assumed a similarly ready stance. With one hand, he held his knife in front of him, the blade gently swaying from side to side. The other hand was clenched into a fist. Musashi prepared his strongest thrusters on the flat side of luminescence. This would be the strongest, the fastest he was capable of. That meant that the initial approach would be reliant on his own body alone, of course, but Musashi had confidence in his own abilities. That should be fastest slash or strike that I'll use. Rayonch took a deep breath, his golden eyes scanning Musashi's every movement. There was a strange glimmering light there, anticipation and caution mingling together, an unspoken plea for his opponent to show what they were worth. Despite his distaste for the man's delaying tactics, Musashi had to admit that this Rayonch was a warrior at heart too. Rayonch cleared his throat. A drop of Musashi's sweat hit the floor. Musashi launched himself forward, luminescence held overhead, ready to strike down the moment Rayonch came to range. No shouts or screams escaped Musashi's throat this time. There was only the cold silence of an intended kill. But he had miscalculated. The tiniest of smirks spread over the grey-haired man's face, and Rayonch's closed fist opened, revealing the small pebble held within. It began to rattle. It began to glow. Musashi's eyes widened, and he... What happened? Darnell?
You tell me? Oh, are you swinging it back to me?
Yeah.
The explosion was deafening at point-blank range, and if it wasn't for Rayonch's pre-deployed defenses, he was sure his eardrums would have burst from the sheer noise. Still, looked at another way, that meant it was an effective stratagem. No sane opponent would expect him to set off an explosion so close to his own body. They would be accustomed to cowards who believed in heresies like exclusively ranged attacks. Your lack of imagination was your doom, brave warrior, Rayonch intoned, choosing each word as carefully as possible. He needed to express as much respect to the fallen as he could. With one smooth motion, Rayonch swept his knife... Your name's blocking me here.
Sorry.
Swept his knife in front of him, his arm flooded with chaotic red aether that shifted from dark red to light red and back. The sheer speed and force of the targetless attack swept away the smoke and debris that had crowded the air, revealing what should have been the corpse of a toy Musashi. Did he use his aether to protect himself from the explosion? Is that what happened?
We'll see.
I'm talking about Rayonch.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so
he mentioned he has pre-deployed defenses,
Okay.
so...
What should have been the corpse of a toy Musashi? Rayonch blinked. There was no corpse of a toy Musashi in front of him. In fact, there was no corpse at all. That couldn't be right. He looked around, eyebrows furrowed, as if he just missed Musashi's body on initial inspection. There was rubble littered everywhere, concrete and plastic still raining down, but no organic material. Had he vaporized Musashi? Surely he wasn't that strong. Had some demonic power awakened within him? There was a sound like that of roaring flame from above, and Rayon snapped his head up to look at it. His eyes widened and his jaw fell open. A toy Musashi stood above, black hair billowing around him, all that was left of his shirt being black cinders that were even now falling away to reveal his bare chest. Uh-oh, fan service for the ladies! Muscular body covered with countless scars. At first, Rayon thought he was standing on the air itself, but at a second glance he saw it was much more extraordinary. He was standing on the flat side of his sword as if the thing were a surfboard, thrusters flaring out from each side of its controlled direction, and his arms thrust out to adjust the angle of his movement. What the hell, Musashi Silver Surfer? Musashi glanced down at him, gray eyes impassive. A huge, flickering advertisement behind him bathed him in the light, as though the gods of combat had granted him a halo for this feat. For a moment, Rayanch thought about deploying more bombs to continue their bout, but his hands wouldn't move. His body simply couldn't accept the idea of destroying such a splendid image. What the fuck is with this guy? He's like too choony. It would be like taking a flamethrower to a fresh snowy field. Instead, his arms simply fell to his sides, and he nodded in respect. Musashi returned the nod, just slightly, and then his gaze returned to the direction the car had gone, and a second later, he too was gone, pursuing the vehicle. Rayanch blinked, still staring at the spot where he'd seen that most beautiful of images. It was as though something vital to his existence had revealed itself there, some great enigma he'd been tasked with solving. A long-held breath burst from his mouth. Incredible. It seemed a little too anime villain, I'm not gonna lie. That kind of did not fit the tone, but it was funny. This was only the second time Musashi had used this technique, and he wasn't any more fond of it this time. Putting his filthy shoes on Luminescence's blade was like throwing his own child in mud, and he resolved to clean his poor sword as soon as possible. He'd been unkind to it this night, dragging it along the ground when approaching Hadrian, and now this. His anger driven him to unsightly behavior. That was a disgraceful flaw, one he had to work on as much as he could. With Luminescence as a steed, Musashi weaved through the night traffic like a thread shooting through 1,000 needles, ignoring the myriad honks of disapproval from the vehicles he passed. While it was unfortunate he had to break traffic laws, he had no other choice if he were to catch Hadrian. The coward had already had a few minutes head start. He couldn't waste any more time. He swerved around the corner, almost slipping off of Luminescence for one horrifying moment before regaining his balance with a split-second thruster deployed on his arm. He didn't allow the panic to last long, though. His quarry was in front of him, the limousine still some distance away, but clearly visible all the same. The slight smile Musashi allowed himself quickly turned into a puzzled frown. A huge, hulking figure was standing atop the vehicle, locked in battle with Ruth Blaine, who was crawling around the exterior of the car with some kind of spider monkey, occasionally lunging out to strike with those claws of hers. Every time she tried that, however, her new opponent blocked easily with a huge quarterstaff in his hands. Musashi couldn't see the man's face from here, but he could see the V glowing with orange aether on his forehead. There was no mistaking that. The fifth dead. "A toy!" came Marie's voice over his earpiece. Somehow that tiny piece of technology had survived Rayanch's explosion. "Is that you on the sword?" He nodded again, forgetting that she couldn't see him. Well, actually, given her statement, she probably could see him. "Yes," he finally said, just to be sure. "That's fucking awesome!" Oh my god. Alright, everyone, we can stop stroking Musashi's ego now. Even with the current situation, Musashi couldn't help a giddy half-smile from crossing his face. "Yes," he said, doing his best to retain the dignity of his station. "I'm aware." Oh my fucking god. "What can I do for you, Officer Hazard?" "Well," she said, "I thought you'd want to know that Dragon Hadrian isn't in that car anymore." Musashi's heart dropped. "What?" he said, adjusting his angle slightly to stop a traffic drone from slamming into his face. "Where is he, then? That big guy tossed him out of the window a few streets back." "You mean the fifth dead? Is that who he is?" "Anyway, that's what happened. He went flying down, then Delsed jumped out after him." Musashi bit his lip. An awful, cold feeling of failure settled over him like a heavy sheet. "Hadrian's dead, then?" he said quietly, surprised at the disappointment in his own voice. It was more than an anticlimax. It was like some opportunity had permanently passed Musashi by. An opportunity for what, he wasn't sure, but it had slipped through his grasp all the same. Then Marie spoke. "Not necessarily." Musashi slowed his pursuit slightly, the blazing light from his thrusters dimming just a tad. "What do you mean?" "I had a glance, and Delsed seemed to be up to something. I'm shooting some coordinates. Check them out, maybe?" As the script in his pocket lit up, Musashi faltered slightly, watching the vehicle shrink ahead of him. Hadrian was his target, true, and the opportunity to catch him had become possible once again. But the fifth dead was a legend! Would the chance to fight him, or fight alongside him, present itself again? I love how he was just having an existential crisis about maybe not being able to fight Dragon, and then he's like, "Well, but the fifth dead,
well,
bro."
It's like, now it's
it would
not
be
impossible anymore.
It would be like doing battle with Balte Kojiro, or the legendary... How do you pronounce that?
Nigen.
Nigen Rush, the one whose light had led Musashi down this path. A chance to stand among titans! Musashi closed his eyes, shook his head. No, he'd made a promise to himself. And he never broke a promise once made. He zoomed down, not giving the car a second glance. Alright, I'm going back to you.
Are you sure this is a good idea, Bruno? Said Serena, sounding skeptical. Of course! Bruno squeezed through gritted teeth, holding Dragon close as they fell. Trust me, okay? Sure thing, Bruno.
I love how your Bruno's like Joey Wheeler.
Sudden guilt struck his heart like one of those pink arrows. If he messed this up and they died here, he'd been killing Serena too. He hadn't even thought about that before jumping out the car. Hell, he hadn't really thought about anything before jumping out the car. No. There was no time for guilt. The key to being alive was making decisions without hesitation. Hesitation is defeat, as they say. That was what...
Oh, yeah, baby.
That was what Jakob had always said, and Bruno believed in Jakob's words more than anything else.
I'm still curious. I assume Jakob was the previous owner of this body. I'm wondering what the fuck Bruno and Serena are. I have a couple guesses, but I'll go over them after this ends.
He'd already made the decision. All he had to do now was enact it. His force field had been able to speed up his fall, so all he had to do now was slow it down. Bruno held his breath, focused his mind, tapped into some of the memories that Jakob had left behind. Ignoring the splitting headaches that felt like it would burst from his skull, that should be they, Bruno rummaged through the mental corpse, the loose collection of memories, doing his best not to look at things that weren't his to intrude upon. The Sed, that red dome standing alone amidst a snowstorm of fool's ice. The acclimatization procedures.
So here's an interesting thing. You said the Sed is now a location, and we also know that Drannel is a location. Do people often get... Is there like a system where your last name is like what planet or system you're from?
Well, I believe Drell means of the, so... E.
Yeah, so Del Sed, but then also the Simeon Del Drannel. We know the Drannel breaches our place, so he's named after a place too.
Yeah, so if someone has Del in their name, it's a good guess that their last name is where they're from.
It's like of the X, okay.
Yeah.
So it'd be like saying Anthony of the England.
The acclimatization procedures, bizarre shapes shifting and stretching on the schemes like long-lost sea creatures. Cott's stupid smug face, his fingers twirling a lock of his red hair as they sat in the classroom. Glowing red eyes staring out of him throughout the darkness of interrogation room, tunneling into his mind like a drill. And finally, formless liquid flowing from Jakob's palms, ready to be sculpted into whatever shape was needed, swords and shields both.
Oh, he used to have the best of both worlds.
Jakob's ability being Jakob's alone, and there's no way Bruno could use it straight up. But if he could learn from it, incorporate the principles into his shields just slightly, then they could survive this. Bruno squeezed his eyes shut and summoned a series of force fields beneath them, making them just strong enough to technically exist, but so weak that he and Dragan passed through them essentially unimpeded. Again, Bruno kept summoning more, each one rippling and breaking as they passed through it. And yes, they were slowing down as they fell. In the space of a few seconds, their speed had gone from lethal to near lethal to injurious. He opened his eyes wide. This, he knew, was the best that they were getting. Bruno summoned one last force field at a slight angle, this one strong enough to make contact with, and destroyed it just before he and Dragan hit it, the propulsion sending them flying off in another direction. In the direction of a huge window on the building next to them. Bruno closed his eyes again in preparation for impact. Bruno and Dragan...
Oh, that was smart.
Yeah, big brain. Bruno and Dragan both infused their bodies with as much aether as they could as they smashed through the glass, falling roughly on the floor
that
beyond...
Should be
as they rolled to a halt. The sounds of a crowd around them trailed off, its fading punctuated by a series of screams at their sudden entrance. With a rough cough, Bruno opened his eyes, blinking blearily at the unexpected light around them. The building they'd landed in seemed to be some kind of casino, rows of slot machines operated by gamblers of every age and shape. Some of them hadn't even stopped to look at the sudden interruption, instead just continuing to roll the slots. Looking around, Bruno couldn't help but a laugh from escaping his lips. They'd survived that. They'd actually survived that. Serena too let out a mental cheer. "You're gonna let go of me now," mumbled Dragan, face buried in the carpets. "Uh-oh," said Bruno, pulling his arms back and staggering to his feet. Sorry." Dragan rolled over in some approximation of a sitting position, leaning against a nearby pillar. Don't worry about it." It seemed they had landed in the fancier area of the casino, full of patoli tables populated by finely dressed men and women. The civilians around the spot they'd landed backed away as what looked like private security approached, aiming plasma pistols. "Hands up!" one yelled, voice surprisingly squeaky for a man his size. "Hands in the air, now!" Bruno slowly put his hands up, surprised at the sheer fatigue playing in his limbs. With the way this night had gone, being taken in by some rent-a-cops didn't even seem like the worst-case scenario. In fact, "Oh, fuck me," muttered Dragon from behind him, all the life drained from his voice. In front of Bruno, the security officer's eyes widened to the size of saucers, and the tiny pistol slipped from his grip. A second later, he joined the rest of the nearest civilians in running for the nearest exit, occupation forgotten in the face of mortal terror. Slowly, as if the thing behind him would only come to exist once he looked at it, Bruno turned around. Given Dragon's response, he already had some idea of what he'd see. A toy Musashi was outside the broken window, standing on his floating, shining sword. It was as if he were walking on light itself. His cold grey eyes were fixed on Dragon, the gaze of an executioner. "There you are," he said, the slightest satisfaction in his tone.
Oh man, alright, I have so many thoughts about Bruno. So, Jakob apparently had two working hands at one point. Because we know Bruno and Serena got the fucked up hand. Like, it works, but they have to use Aether to do shit. I have a lot of theories about what the fuck Bruno and Serena are. Maybe orphans or kids of the original Jakob that he, like, saved by putting them in him. Maybe a split personality. But I'm thinking about it. I know Aether can program abilities, and they seem like they're accessing his old memories, like they're using his body after he's gone. What if he used Aether, and they mentioned he's super fucking good at Aether. What if he used Aether to create them as, like, maybe originally they were, like, secondary, like, minds or systems to help him do abilities, but now they're all that's left after the original Jakob died somehow, and now they're sort of like people, but like not people, and they have to share a body. And like Serena was the personality in charge of offense, and Bruno was in charge of defense, which is why they can each only use that ability.
Interesting.
And they said it can't be as good as Jakob because maybe Jakob was able to supplement his own power with theirs before. That's my new theory.
Nice. Yeah, we got some good.
And I think I'm pretty close to the truth.
Del said lore.
Yeah, I'm excited. I feel like as funny as it was, and it was very anime in its own way, I feel like it was a little too far that everyone was just like fucking jaw-dropping and like it's sucking Musashi's dick this chapter a little bit.
Well, to be fair, it was only really Rayange that...
No, dude, everyone. Even these guys with guns were like, whoa! And they ran away from a dude standing outside the window on a sword.
On nothing. but...
And also Marie was like, "You're so fucking cool," and then he was like, "I know." It was like just a little over the top, but I feel like it would be a lot cooler with visuals, like if it was like in an animation or a movie. But it felt a little silly in a book. But you know what? I'm not gonna knock you for it. It's fun, and I like Musashi, but I could see other people like rolling their eyes at that part. But overall, that was a really good chapter. I really want to see more. I'm excited.
Yeah, well, you keep thinking you've got away from Musashi, but you've not.
It's funny, though, the beginning I expected to be a lot more somber, but Dragon, even when he was assured he would die, was extremely snarky the whole way through.
His personality does not change.
Death is nothing to him. I mean, it was that one time against Samael when he was, like, talking to his younger self, but not this time. He was more snarky about it this time. I was surprised, honestly. I expected when he thought he was going to die for you to go into, like, the little kid mode again, where he, like, talks to himself to figure out the solution. Or, like, maybe get more Mr. Fix lore. I'm surprised that didn't come up at all.
Yeah, it's more because when falling to death from a great height is not something you can, like, do as much about, so his mind didn't really go there.
Right. I thought he would, like, try to desperately last-minute invent an Aether technique. Although I do feel like this moment, after they finally survive, will be the catalyst for Dragon to be like, "Hey, I need some Aether techniques. Please? A crumb?" Because he doesn't have any yet, and we're already in Arc 3, and he needs one. And I'm curious what it'll be. But, my question for you is, do you think Musashi was epic, or do you think it was over the top this chapter? I want to hear your thoughts.
Right, we'll see.
Alright, any other announcements, Tanhony?
No.
Alright, well that was a good one. I'm invested.
Nice.
I'm excited. We're having a good time,
Yeah, we've almost finished the beginning of Arc 3.
Beginning?
Yeah.
How long is Arc 3? I love how you were all like, I'll make the lore video for Aetheral Space after Arc 3, and I was like, okay, that shouldn't be too much longer. And I now see that that was the ultimate procrastination technique.
I gotta let the story breathe. There's a lot of moving parts here.
Oh. Alright. Bye!
Bye!